Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 114, Unit 5, where we're talking about issues of distributive justice. In other words, what should we do and what's the proper way that we should react and respond to the massive inequality and suffering that exists around the globe? And what is the just distribution of all this? How should things be organized? How should we react? How should we respond? These are the kinds of issues that we're digging into this unit. So, this lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to briefly recap some vocab that we need. We're going to take a look at Singer's theory about duties of beneficence. And then we're going to start looking at how this applies to notions of charity and look at an opposing view and sort of dig in a little bit more into this question of how should we respond to massive inequality, and are we obligated to respond in some way? So, just as a bit of a recap and some big picture positioning for our lecture, because I'm a big picture kind of guy and I like keeping context the stuff we look at, so we don't just go from reading to reading to reading without any sort of connection. So, last time, in addition to the issue overview, we dug into some issues surrounding distributive justice itself and how we should approach rights. And so we looked at two competing theories of justice. One is John Rawls's theory, which argues that some inequalities are justifiable so long as they benefit all sorts of people, so as long as they benefit everyone. And so long as it benefits people, so long as we can satisfy what needs they're obligated to have, we should allow some unequal treatment of people at times. We also looked at Nozick's position instead, which stresses the notion of negative rights and says that, well, the notion of a positive right of being entitled or obligated to something doesn't make any sense on a basic framework of personal and essential liberties. Now, our focus for this lecture is far less abstract. Rather than looking at how rights should play into each other and what justice is, instead what we're going to focus on, what do we as individuals have an obligation to do, given the fact that the world is vastly unequal in its distribution of goods. What should we do, and what are we obligated to do to try and deal with this issue? In other words, do we have what's called a duty of beneficence, a duty to help others in need and to do as much good as possible? Or are these kinds of actions what we might call supererogatory? That is, are they above and beyond the call of duty? Are they good and praiseworthy, things that we should celebrate and desire to do, but they're not required of us? They're not duties or obligations that we have. Which of these two positions is right? So this lecture and the readings that we discuss are going to be less about what we should do as a society and less about what the structure of all these sorts of things should be, and more about what we as individual people in the here and now should do to respond to massive economic inequality. Now, to do that, our first and main author on the subject is Peter Singer, the same guy that we looked at with our animal rights discussion. Now, there, Singer argued for animal rights and that sort of thing based on a very simple criterion. It doesn't matter whether or not animals, non-human animals, that is, have the ability to critically think the same way as us, or whether they've got language. Instead, we should assign moral status on a far more simple criterion. We should give things moral status so long as they suffer, because suffering is something that we should alleviate. Similarly, well, from a radically different sort of position this time, Singer's going to argue that because of a couple of very basic moral principles that you probably already agree to, you should probably rethink the way that you approach charity. In fact, he thinks that almost all of us think about charity and giving to charity, that is, donating money to help those in need. The way that we think about that is severely misguided and mistaken, according to Singer. Because when we talk about charity, we generally talk about it as something that's supererogatory. We think about it as something that's good or nice to do, but you're not obligated to do it. In other words, you're not a bad person if you don't regularly give large amounts of money to charity. And if you don't give at all, you're not doing anything morally wrong, most of us think. You might be a bit of a jerk, you might be a bit of an asshole, but you're not necessarily a morally bad person. You're just a little more selfish, maybe, than you ought to be, or something like that. Singer thinks this is the wrong way to think about charity and giving to others. Instead, Singer argues that we do, in fact, have an obligation, a duty, to give to those in need around the world. We have a strong duty of beneficence. And so he thinks that you should give in addition to everyone else. And he thinks that you already think this, or at least you have most of the thought there. And if you were to just put two and two together, you would notice and you would agree that you have this kind of obligation. Singer thinks that you already believe in two basic moral principles that together form an argument for having an obligation to help others in need, wherever they might be on the planet. And to show this, Singer offers a pair of very basic thought experiments. The first of which is not a particularly difficult moral problem. Singer says, imagine a child drowning in the river. In fact, we can put this in Lafayette if it helps those of you who live in the area to contextualize things. If not, imagine your local river that's full of filth and whatever else, because God knows what's in the Wabash these days. So, imagine a child drowning in the river, just 10 feet away from the shore. And imagine that it's Friday night and you're out on your way to a party or some other get together with friends, and you're dressed very sharply for the occasion. You're on fleek, or whatever the term is that you younger millennials use. I'm one of you, but there's some terms I just can't get behind. Anyway, imagine that you're dressed well and you're on your way to some sort of get together and you see a child drowning in the river just merely feet from you. It'd be a simple thing for you to wade into the muck and to yank them out. You would save the child's life almost certainly. There's no issues of probability or anything else. But if you did do that, suppose that you'd ruin your nice clothes. Or like if you're the one bringing the drinks to the get together, you'd have to give up the beer. You'd have to give up some sort of minor little luxury or convenient thing in order to save the child. But otherwise, it's a very simple thing to do. Here, Singer asked the question, should you save the child? And pretty much all of us would shake our heads slowly. We kind of glance at each other. Like, yeah, duh. Should save the kid. Who cares if my shoes get ruined? It's a kid's life. I can reach him. It's not a big deal. It didn't put me at risk. I should save the kid. And virtually all of us, statistically anyway, agree. And Singer says that this is probably the right response here. It seems pretty plain that we should help people whenever we can, unless it costs us something of equivalent moral value. That is, it's perfectly fine to sacrifice one's clothes or the beer to save someone from drowning in the river. But if the stakes were raised to the point where we might lose our lives trying to save the kid, well, now it starts getting iffier because then there's no real net gain. You save someone else, but you don't necessarily make the world a better place or anything like that. It would probably still be praiseworthy, but you're certainly not required to lay down your life to save someone else. At least so long as it's just one person anyway. But clothes you can give up. They're not nearly as important, morally speaking. They're not nearly as significant, morally speaking, as someone else's life. So, Singer thinks we can all pretty much agree on this point. It's not really a controversial philosophical topic here. Now imagine another circumstance, another child. And suppose that on a different night or a different day, you're walking alongside the river and you see another child drowning just 10 feet away. It's easy to get to him. Now, aside from your horrible luck in being near drowning children these days, something that probably the FBI might ought to look into, uh, aside from your horrible luck, it's a pretty easy thing for you to save the kid. This is not a difficult situation for you to be in. If the kid's 10 feet away and I can easily get to him, I should save him, just like in the first case. And pretty much all of us agree. But now, instead of imagining shoes or lost beer or whatever else, imagine that the next day There's a kid drowning in the river 100 feet away from shore. Not 10, but 100. But imagine you had a boat that you could get to him with virtually no risk on your part. Most of us still agree that so long as we can get to the kid, we should save him. And the same is true no matter what number we put there. Suppose that we're out at Lake Michigan and the kid's drowning 1,000 feet away. We've got a jet ski and a couple of people to help us. Now, should you save him? Well, probably, yeah. About 10,000 feet, and so on and so forth. So long as we know about the kid's suffering, Singer says, and so long as we can help them, most of us agree we ought to help. Physical distance on its own doesn't really affect our moral obligations. So it seems like no matter how far away someone is, as long as we can help, and it's not particularly costly to us, seems like we should. And most of us agree. We already believe in these ideas, these basic moral principles. But here's the kicker, Singer says. If we combine these two principles that you already probably agree with, you get the conclusion that you have an obligation to give to charity. And not only should you give to charity, but you should give as much as you can to charity to help save lives. Because you see, the world is a rough place. On average, malaria kills a child under 5 every 2 minutes. For those of you who have watches or clocks nearby and are particularly morbidly minded, you might even mark what time it is right now, or take a look at the video and count off the next 2 minutes. A child younger than 5 probably dies in those 2 minutes. In 2016, there were nearly 300,000 deaths in this age group alone. Children under 5 who died of malaria in 2016, all around the world. This is one of the most severe lethal diseases and one of the most preventable. Because you see, it turns out that one of the best preventative measures, one of the best ways to not get malaria is to sleep under a mosquito net, so that in your most vulnerable and inactive time, perfect time for mosquitoes to bite and transfer the deadly parasite, so long as you sleep under a mosquito net, you probably won't get the disease. And long-lasting insecticide-treated mosquito nets to use at home, on average, they cost about $2. And an efficient or well-run charity, of which there are many, can buy these and distribute them. So long as you do your research and you find a trustworthy charity with a good record and good effectiveness, you can very effectively and efficiently donate money and save lives all around the world without even leaving home. In fact, right on this video, right here, I have included a link to Oxfam America. Oxfam, despite some of their recent personnel controversies, is one of the most highly regarded charities on earth. They have some of the most efficiency. They have the best bang for your buck, so to speak. They benefit people in hundreds of countries, and they do massive good all around the planet. I've got the link right there where you can set up very small donations. I think they even have a way to text and donate money through your phone bill in certain situations. So right now, I've made it possible for you, wherever you're at, to save someone's life. And you can do it for a minimal amount of money. It's something you can do. It's something that doesn't cost you anything of great moral significance. You're not losing your life. You're not ruining your way of living or anything like that. And we've already agreed that physical distance doesn't matter to your obligations. You ought to save a kid drowning 10, 100, or 1,000 feet away. Why not 10,000 miles or wherever else? So, if that's the case, if it's true that you ought to save lives regardless of distance, as long as you can help, and that you should do so long as it doesn't cost us something equivalent, Singer says that we ought to give. We have a strong obligation. We have a strong duty of beneficence. And in fact, Singer says there's even two different ways we could take this conclusion, and both of them involve radically rethinking how we approach charity and helping others. Singer argues that there's a strong reading and a weak reading of the conclusion. The strong conclusion of putting these couple of principles together, along with the fact that things are as bad as they are, the strong conclusion to draw from that is that we should donate money to charity to the point of what he calls marginal utility. That is, you should give to charity until giving any more would cause an equal amount of suffering to what you're solving. So if you're an average college student in the United States, given our cost of living, you are not necessarily wealthy on average. Compared to people all around the world, you are massively wealthy in terms of the amount of money you can give. And so if we're helping specifically the worst off, the people who need help the most, you should, on the strong conclusion, give the money and help alleviate that suffering until giving any more would stop you from having the same basic necessities you're trying to provide to somebody else. Because at that point, there's no net benefit. It's like giving away clothes until you're down to one shirt. It doesn't make any sense for you to give your one shirt to a shirtless person because there's still a shirtless guy running around. Only this time it's you instead of somebody else. So there is a limit to how much you should give, but that limit is very, very far down. It's something that you're probably not going to reach anytime soon, given our position in the relatively privileged Western world. So that's the strong conclusion. It says that you are morally obligated to do this sort of thing. But even the weak conclusion says that we should give to charity and we should save lives until we have to sacrifice something of significant moral value. And he's not even saying here for the weak conclusion something of equal moral value. He's just saying anything whatsoever of significant moral value. Like, say you're just going to inconvenience your life in some way where you can't enjoy things as much as you could before. Like maybe you can't go out with friends nearly as much as you could previously. This is still massively more than what Westerners on average give to charity, period. And it's still a radical rethinking of our moral obligations because it's saying that you're obligated, you ought to give to this degree. And in fact, you're doing something morally wrong if you don't do it. If you notice the title of this particular slide, what's the last thing you spent $2 on? If $2 would save a life, that seems to be a far better use of the money, morally speaking, than anything else you could buy pretty much in the United States, other than saving another life for $2. Let's assume that you bought a 20-ounce soda, because that's something like $1.75 or $1.90, depending on where you're buying it and how much the convenience store is ripping you off. Let's suppose that the last thing you bought was a 20-ounce soda, 20-ounce pop for all you Midwesterners. If you had a choice between saving somebody's life and drinking Coke, is it morally permissible to not choose to save somebody's life? Seems like the arguments and the things that the Singer has presented, and oddly enough, you yourself, if you agreed with those arguments, would say is that no, it's not morally okay to choose sugar water over someone's life. But that's effectively what you did when you spent $2 on that soda. You effectively chose, I would rather drink sugar water for the next 20 minutes rather than save somebody's life. And even if you were unaware of the situation, or unaware of what you could have done, well, maybe that relieves the wrongness or the badness of the situation somewhat. But now you do know. Now you do know what kind of impact all of this could have. And now you do know how many lives you could be saving with trivial amounts of money to most of us. Not to everybody, of course, but to most of us. And even to those of us that it's not trivial, probably you're not going to die over not having $2, where somebody else might. So it seems as though we have a strong moral obligation to help those in need. We have a strong duty of beneficence. We ought to respond to massive inequality by, we ought to respond by giving and saving as many lives as we possibly can. Now, despite the simplicity of that argument, and despite some of the power of the argument, like rhetorically speaking, probably a lot of you are not too happy with the idea. You may be objecting in some sense rationally, you may just not like it, or whatever else. But if that's the case, you're not alone. While Singer is in many ways a brilliant ethicist, and I think is worth noting, somewhat at least lives up to his own ideas. He gives a full 25% of his salary before ever seeing it straight to charity. He is one of the most charitable givers, at least percentage wise, in the country. Like obviously there are people that beat him out, the people who signed various billionaires' pledges and whatever else. But for a university professor, it's a massive amount to give. And so Singer does deserve at least some credit for mostly living up to his arguments, though it's debatable whether or not that's going to be really the point of marginal utility for him and his wife, considering how he lectures at Princeton, if I remember. But despite the fact that he mostly lives up to the idea, and despite the fact that it seems to be a simple and straightforward argument, a lot of people have objections here. And so, as part of those objections, we might follow Garrett Hardin's argument and criticism instead, who argues that giving and donating to those in need actually puts more people at risk. And he refers to this type of thinking as lifeboat ethics. Hardin has us imagine a lifeboat with limited seats. So imagine after like the Titanic sank or something like that, people are out in lifeboats, and some people are in the boats and some people are in the water. Now each boat can only hold so many people and still safely be afloat. And so supposing that you're in a boat with say 10 seats, we might wonder if, yeah, you should fill up the boat maybe. Or perhaps even fill it over capacity. Fill as many people as will fit in the boat and the thing will still be upright. If we follow Singer's type argument, that seems to be the response that we should have in this type of situation. But Hardin says that this is actually the wrong way to think about what's going on. Because if the lifeboat has 10 seats, that's what it was designed to operate at. And so you could probably fit 20 people in there, and it would still float. But you've removed all aspect of a safety factor that was built into that boat. In fact, the first wave that hits an overstuffed lifeboat will probably tip it over and put everybody back in the water, and now at risk of drowning again. So it doesn't actually make any sense, rationally speaking, to overfill the boats and put as many people as possible in there. Because by doing so, you basically put everybody at risk. Now, instead of there being 9 people or 10 people at risk, safe from drowning, and say an equal number in the water at risk of drowning, now 20 people are at risk of drowning, and the boat's gone if it topples over. So, Hardin says, the better choice instead is to try and leave some degree of a safety factor and to not try and save as many people as possible so you can instead have a better chance of saving some smaller group of people. In the context of economic inequality, this means that Singer's idea of giving money and saving as many people as possible is not something that we ought to be doing. Because in that sort of case, if all of us were to actually follow this advice, like say the entire United States suddenly shifted to a far more charitable mindset, Hardin argues that if that sort of case were to happen, then the United States would all of a sudden be at risk of just as much, if not more, suffering than the people that are having money given to them. By focusing exclusively on saving as many people as possible, we essentially put ourselves at risk to a certain degree. We risk economic ruin, we risk not having enough for ourselves, we risk emergencies happening and us no longer having the cushion or the emergency fund or the safety factor that would otherwise keep us safe. And Hardin also points out that donating to charity in particular runs the risk of what he calls the ratchet effect, where effectively what happens is that by donating to charity, you can actually make some emergencies worse. So imagine that a population somewhere in the world is at size one. We'll just be really abstract in general with this. And suppose that that population, that's size one, has a famine of some sort. Like the crops don't grow, disease comes through and wipes out a lot of the plants, and now all of a sudden that population is starving. If the rest of the world chips in and provides relief in the sense of like providing food to those that are hungry, the population survives and they keep growing. But you've done nothing to solve the original problems that caused the famine. And so the population survives. And because populations do what populations do, it grows. So now it's size two. But the same issues still exist. They still grow crops that are vulnerable to certain kinds of diseases. They're still depending on certain agricultural systems that maybe don't work. Their technology isn't keeping pace with the population. And so now at size two, again, another famine happens. And so the rest of the world steps in and provides food relief and provides disaster relief. And so the population survives and starts to grow again to size three. Each time, with each emergency and with each donation, Hardin says, we effectively ratchet up the severity of each further emergency to where more and more people now are suffering. And there are larger and larger crises. And eventually, it may get to the point where we can't save them. And the crisis is more massive than if we had done nothing in the first place. And so Hardin says it may actually be better, morally speaking, to not give in these ways, at least not to charity or to do the kinds of things that Singer advocates, because we run the risk of making things worse. Now, Singer doesn't have an explicit written reply to this, at least not in anything that we read. But one could very easily reply and object to this sort of position. Yeah, because we do need to consider objections to both of these types of views. Singer could reply and offer the objection that, well, just because we might make things worse in the future doesn't mean that we shouldn't help people that are suffering now. Just because, like if we had a child drowning in the river again, the fact that I might get too worn out to save my family later, or that I might get, injured or harmed in some way that stops me from saving other people later, that shouldn't stop me from saving somebody now. The fact remains that there is someone drowning in the river right this moment, and that still demands morally that we do something about it. Maybe there are other solutions that should be found that don't cause this ratchet effect, if it is in fact documented well enough to be something that happens. That's something that social scientists need to look into, or perhaps have, and I simply don't have the research on it. But the point is that there are objections that can be made, that we still need to respond in some way to the people that are suffering now, regardless of the risk involved and regardless of what might happen to people in the future. But we might also simply object that Singer is demanding too much of us in this kind of picture. We might object, instead of using Hardin's examples of the lifeboat ethics or the ratchet effects stuff, we might simply say that Singer is suggesting that we live in a way that we shouldn't have to live. Our every financial decision would have to be structured around giving to charity and helping others, and seeing whether or not we've given as much as we can in a situation. And this seems like the wrong way for people to live their lives. This seems like it's missing so many of the things that make life what it is. And so it seems as though Singer runs afoul of what we might call the demandingness objection. His theory is simply too demanding for most people to actually follow it. We might also go into Singer's argument, and just like we would reject a bad premise, we might reject one or both of Singer's two principles. This is a bit difficult, however, given how intuitive they are, and so we'd have to be very careful in what kind of reasons and arguments that we gave against them, simply because they might end up being less plausible than the arguments that Singer gives. The easiest objection, I think, though, if you are going to object to one of those two principles, is to simply say that distance does still have some effect on our moral obligations. For example, we might say that we should help those that are close to us before we help those that are far away. But even this argument has issues. For one, Singer's point that you should be giving and helping people as much as possible, all of a sudden that just shifts focus to those that are nearby instead of those that are far away. We might also object that if you do want to say that, oh, well, you should help people close to home before you worry about people in far off places. Well, people close to home may be suffering, but they may not be suffering nearly as much as those that lack the truly basic necessities for life in other places of the world, or those that suffer from diseases like malaria. The severity of the need and the severity of the suffering demands that we do something about those further away rather than those close by. So there are objections, but none of them are very perfect, and none of them are necessarily clear cut, which is why we do all of this. There's a lot to digest, there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of things that we ought to consider as moral citizens of the world. And so it's something that is very much worth taking the time to think about. Now, that about wraps up our discussion of economic justice. We've talked about rights, we've talked about theories of justice, we've talked about what we as individuals ought to be doing about this stuff. And we've looked at a couple of the aspects of these problems that are worth paying attention to. Next unit, we're going to start looking at corruption and free speech in politics, which is unfortunately an all too timely subject that applies to virtually everything in the news these days. And we'll spend a couple of units digging into various parts of those issues. We'll spend some time on free speech, we'll spend some time on money in politics, and we'll spend a little bit of time, one of my favorite brief discussions, whether or not it's okay to punch Nazis in the face. Always a fun break. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. In the meantime, before we get to all those points, don't forget to take a look at the journals and the quiz. Here, once again, for those of you who might be interested, is a link to Oxfam America and their donation page, because even if Singer's wrong, it's worth at least thinking about doing this sort of thing. Even if he's wrong that we have an obligation to do so, it does help an awful lot of people. But, food for thought, things to digest. Until next time, guys, happy thinking.